Never be generous. Machiavelli's warning on money.
The dangerous illusion of generosity. There is a lie almost everyone is taught from childhood. A lie so deeply woven into society that questioning it makes you look cold, selfish, or even wicked. And that lie is this: if you are generous, people will love you. At first, it sounds noble. It sounds moral. It sounds like the kind of advice that builds a good human being. But if you observe life carefully, if you stop listening to what people say and begin studying what people actually do, you will discover something far more disturbing. Generosity, when misunderstood, does not always create love. Sometimes it creates weakness. Sometimes it creates dependence. And often it creates disrespect. This is one of the harshest warnings hidden in Machiavelli's understanding of power, status, and survival. Because Machiavelli understood something most people are too emotional to admit. The world does not reward sacrifice the way fairy tales promised. In fact, the more carelessly generous you become, the more likely you are to attract parasites, opportunists, and silent users disguised as friends, family, lovers, and admirers. And that is the tragedy. The very thing you thought would make people value you may be the exact thing teaching them to use you. Tonight, we are going deep. Not into surface level don't help people nonsense. No. We are going into the psychology of generosity, the politics of giving, the hidden economics of respect, and the brutal truth Machiavelli understood centuries ago. A man who gives too much eventually loses the power to command. And once that power is gone, the same people who praised your kindness may be the first to abandon you. So if you have ever felt used, if you have ever felt overlooked after doing so much for others, if you have ever wondered why the people you help the most often respect you the least, then stay with me, because this may be one of the most important truths you will ever hear. Why generosity looks good but often ends badly. Generosity is one of the most seductive traits in human society because it gives the illusion of virtue. When you give, people clap for you. When you sacrifice, people praise you. When you keep saying yes, people call you kind, selfless, pure-hearted, and different. And for a while, that validation feels good. It makes you feel needed. It makes you feel morally superior. It makes you feel important. But here is where the trap begins. Need and respect are not the same thing. A lot of people are not attached to you. They are attached to what you provide. Your money, your emotional labor, your availability, your access, your resources, your softness, your inability to say no. And because many people confuse being needed with being loved, they continue pouring from themselves until there is almost nothing left. This is why some of the most exhausted people in the world are also the most generous. They are always available, always helping, always fixing, always giving, always carrying everyone else's burden. And yet somehow, they are rarely the most respected person in the room. Why? Because human beings are not wired to automatically respect what is constantly available without cost. Let that sink in. What comes too easily is rarely valued deeply. This is not because all people are evil. It is because psychology works in patterns. People instinctively place value on what is scarce, controlled, and difficult to access. This is why rare things are prized. This is why attention from a selective person feels powerful. This is why the person who says less often carries more weight than the person constantly trying to prove love through endless giving. Machiavelli understood this with frightening clarity. He knew that generosity, if not strategically controlled, becomes expensive, not just financially,
but psychologically and politically. Because the more you give without restraint, the more people begin to see your giving not as a gift, but as an obligation. And once your generosity becomes expected, it loses its magic. Then a very dangerous shift happens. People stop being grateful and start becoming entitled. That is when your kindness stops being appreciated and starts being consumed. The moment your gift becomes their expectation. This is one of the cruelest patterns in human behavior. The first time you help someone, they are grateful. The second time, they are relieved. The third time, they begin to rely on it. The fourth time, they quietly expect it. And by the fifth time, if you do not help, you become the problem. Think about that. Not because you harmed them. Not because you betrayed them. Not because you did something wrong. But because you interrupted the comfort they built around your generosity. This is one of the most painful experiences for naturally giving people. Because they often discover too late that some relationships were not built on love. They were built on access. And access can be mistaken for intimacy. A lot of people do not miss you when you pull back. They miss the benefits. They miss the convenience. They miss the emotional labor you used to perform for free. They miss the financial cushion. They miss the constant reassurance. They miss the way you made life easier for them while making yours harder. And this is exactly why uncontrolled generosity is dangerous. Not because giving is evil, but because giving without boundaries destroys your position. Machiavelli would say this plainly. If your generosity leaves you depleted, dependent, or unable to maintain your own strength, then your generosity is not wisdom. It is weakness dressed in virtue. And the world is full of people who know how to exploit weakness while pretending to admire it. Machiavelli's warning, generosity can make you hated. Now this is where things become deeply uncomfortable. Because most people assume generosity should make you loved. But Machiavelli argued something shocking. Excessive generosity can actually make you hated. At first, that sounds absurd. How can people hate the one who gives? But if you understand power, economics, and human expectation, it begins to make terrifying sense. Here's why. To remain endlessly generous, especially in a visible way, you must constantly spend resources. Money, energy, time, attention, emotional capacity, opportunity. And eventually, those resources begin to run low. When they do, you have only a few options. You either stop giving, or you begin taking from somewhere else to sustain the image of generosity. That is where resentment begins. If you keep giving publicly while privately training yourself, you become bitter. If you use other people's resources to keep looking generous, they begin to resent you. If you overextend yourself financially, you lose independence. If you keep saving everyone else, you neglect yourself. And once you can no longer maintain the standard people became used to, disappointment turns into criticism. That is the part no one tells you. People are often more offended by your withdrawal than they were grateful for your sacrifice. Because once people normalize your generosity, they stop seeing the cost. They only see the interruption. This is why some of the most generous people eventually become deeply cynical. Not because they were born bitter, but because they learn the hard way that unlimited giving teaches unlimited expectation. And expectation is the graveyard of gratitude. Why people often respect the reserved more than the giver. Observe something carefully in social life. The person who is always doing too much often gets emotionally overlooked. But the person who is measured, selective, and controlled often commands quiet respect. Why? Because restraint signals power. Self-control signals standards. And standards create psychological weight. A person who gives everything too quickly communicates something dangerous, even if unintentionally. I do not know how to protect my value. And once people sense that, many of them, consciously or unconsciously, adjust how they treat you. This is not always malicious. Sometimes it is simply instinct. People test the emotional structure of others. They push. They request. They ask for favors. They delay repayment. They overstep boundaries. They joke with disrespect. They take liberties. And every time you over-accommodate without consequence, you are teaching them your price. That is why generosity without discipline becomes self-erasure. you slowly disappear inside other people's needs. You become useful, but not sacred. Helpful, but not honored. Present, but not deeply valued. And once you become a permanent emotional utility, your identity begins to dissolve into service. Machiavelli would never admire that. To him, one of the greatest mistakes a person in power can make is confusing appearing good with remaining strong. Because in this world, if you lose your strength trying to look virtuous, people will applaud your downfall and move on. That is the brutal truth. The economics of human relationships. Most people are uncomfortable hearing this, but it is true. Every relationship has an economy. Not necessarily money, but exchange. Every human connection runs on seen or unseen exchange. Attention for validation. Presence for comfort. Money for access. Loyalty for security. Help for obligation. Time for emotional significance. And
Why many generous people are secretly afraid. Now let's go even deeper, because excessive generosity is not always about kindness. Sometimes it is fear. And this is where the conversation becomes painfully honest. Many people give too much because deep down they are afraid of what happens if they stop. Afraid people will leave. Afraid people will be disappointed. Afraid they will be called selfish. Afraid they will lose approval. Afraid they will no longer feel needed. Afraid they will no longer feel important. So they give. Not always from abundance, sometimes from anxiety. And this changes the entire psychology of generosity. Because now the giving is no longer free. It becomes a survival mechanism, a bargaining tool, a way to secure attachment, a way to reduce rejection, a way to purchase emotional safety. That is not generosity. That is emotional negotiation. And unfortunately, manipulative people can sense this immediately. They can tell when your giving comes from fear. They can feel when your kindness is actually desperation to be accepted. And once they detect that, some of them will quietly exploit it. Not because they respect you, but because they know you are easier to control through guilt than through force. This is one of the darkest truths in human relationships. The person who fears being called selfish is often the easiest person to manipulate, because all it takes is one accusation, one emotional withdrawal, one passive-aggressive silence, one guilt trip, and suddenly they overextend themselves again just to restore peace. Machiavelli would see that for what it is, a dangerous loss of internal sovereignty. If other people can control your behavior by making you feel bad for protecting yourself, then your generosity is no longer yours. It has been weaponized against you. The difference between nobility and naivety. This is where wisdom must enter, because not all generosity is foolish. There is a form of giving that is beautiful, powerful, and noble, but it looks very different from the version most people practice. Naive generosity says, "Take because I don't want conflict." Wise generosity says, "I can give, but I choose when, how, and to whom." Naive generosity is compulsive. Wise generosity is deliberate. Naive generosity empties itself to prove love. Wise generosity preserves itself while still doing good. Naive generosity fears being misunderstood. Wise generosity accepts that boundaries will offend the entitled. This distinction matters more than most people realize, because your life can be destroyed by giving to the wrong people in the wrong way for too long. You can become financially unstable trying to rescue irresponsible people. You can become emotionally broken trying to save people committed to chaos. You can lose years of your life trying to support people who only return guilt, pressure, and expectation. And all the while, you may still be calling yourself kind. But kindness without discernment is not virtue. It is vulnerability without protection. And in a world full of opportunities, that is dangerous. Machiavelli's warning is not be cruel. His warning is more intelligent than that. It is this: never become so committed to appearing generous that you make yourself weak enough to be consumed. That is the trap, and most people do not notice it until they are already exhausted. Why the world often uses the kind, but fears the controlled. There is a strange injustice in human society. The endlessly kind are overburdened, the endlessly available are often undervalued, and the deeply controlled are often taken more seriously. Why? Because people instinctively study what they can get away with. This is why some people forget to pay you back, but never forget to pay someone stricter.
This is why some people constantly cross your boundaries but behave properly around someone else. This is why some people delay responding to the one who is always there but move quickly for the one who is selective. It is not always because the other person is better. Sometimes it is because the other person has trained people to respect limits. And that is what many generous people fail to understand. How you are treated is often shaped by what your behavior permits. You may have a beautiful heart, but if your behavior consistently teaches people that your energy is free, your time is free, your money is flexible, your standards are negotiable, and your no can be pressured into a yes, then do not be shocked when people keep taking. That is not always evil. Sometimes it is simply human adaptation. People move toward ease, and if access to you is too easy, too cheap, too unconditional, your value may remain emotionally invisible, even if your sacrifice is massive. That is why self-respect must sit beside generosity. Without it, generosity becomes a highway for exploitation. The hidden pride inside overgiving. Now here is a truth many people are not ready for. Sometimes excessive generosity is not just fear. Sometimes it is also pride. Yes, pride. Because some people secretly build their identity around being the helper, the giver, the rescuer, the one everyone needs. And that role becomes addictive. It makes them feel powerful, important, central, morally superior. But there is danger in that identity, because once your self-worth depends on being needed, you may unconsciously surround yourself with people who stay broken. You may keep choosing people who drain you. You may keep stepping into dysfunctional situations. You may keep solving problems no one asked you to solve. Why? Because if everyone becomes okay, who are you then? This is a difficult truth, but some people do not just attract chaos, they also maintain it because chaos gives them a role. Machiavelli would have no patience for this. He would call it a failure of self-governance, because if your identity depends on constantly saving others, then your power does not belong to you. It belongs to the crises around you, and that is not strength, that is dependency in disguise. The first rule of real power: never give from weakness. If there is one principle you must remember from this entire part, let it be this: never give from weakness. Never give because you are afraid to lose someone. Never give because guilt is controlling you. Never give because you are trying to buy loyalty. Never give because you want to be chosen. Never give because you are terrified of disappointing people. Because the energy behind your giving shapes the consequences of your giving. If you give from strength, your generosity can be beautiful. If you give from fear, your generosity becomes self-betrayal. And self-betrayal always leaves a wound. Maybe not immediately, maybe not loudly, but over time it creates bitterness, exhaustion, resentment, and quiet emotional collapse. That is why many people who are too nice eventually become emotionally hard. They were not born cold, they were overused. And once they finally see the pattern, they often swing to the opposite extreme. They shut down, they stop trusting, they stop helping, they become guarded, skeptical, distant. Not because they healed, but because they broke. Machiavelli would not want you to become broken or cold. He would want you to become strategic, to understand that generosity must be ruled by intelligence, not impulse. Because in a world where people test limits, exploit softness, and normalize sacrifice, kindness without structure is a liability, and power without boundaries does not survive. So the question is not whether generosity is good. The real question is, who benefits from your generosity, and what is it costing your soul? That is the question most people are too afraid to ask, because once you ask it honestly, you begin to see things differently. You begin to notice who only calls when they need something, who only praises you when you are useful, who becomes distant when you set limits, who grows uncomfortable when you stop overgiving, and who genuinely values you even when you are not providing. That is where the truth begins. And in the next part, we are going deeper into something even darker: why people often love your generosity but do not respect your person. Because there is a painful psychological reason the one who gives the most is often treated the worst. And once you understand it, you will never look at money, favors, loyalty, or human relationships the same way again.
Why people respect what they can lose. There is a painful truth many people spend years avoiding. A truth that only becomes clear after enough disappointment, enough betrayal, enough emotional exhaustion. And that truth is this: people often do not respect what is always available. Read that again. Not because they are all evil, not because every human being is malicious, but because human nature has a dark relationship with access. The more constantly available something becomes, the less psychologically expensive it feels. And when something feels cheap in the mind, it begins to lose weight. This is why a person can do so much for others and still be treated casually, still be delayed, still be ignored, still be disrespected, still be emotionally taken for granted. This is one of the most bitter discoveries in adult life. The person who sacrifices the most is not always the person people value the most. Sometimes it is the opposite. Sometimes the one who gives too much becomes so emotionally available, so financially flexible, so predictably supportive, that people stop seeing them as a person with depth, standards, and limits.
Instead, they begin seeing them as a resource. And once you become a resource in someone's mind, your humanity begins to fade behind your usefulness. That is the tragedy. Not because you were weak, not because you lacked goodness, but because you gave in a way that made your presence easy to consume. And Machiavelli understood something brutal about human beings. People are often more careful with what they fear losing than with what they are confident will remain. That single truth explains more heartbreak, exploitation, and disrespect than most people realize. Because the world often does not reward what is endlessly present. It tests it, uses it, normalizes it, and then undervalues it. Tonight we go deeper into that truth, into the psychology of scarcity, the politics of respect, the emotional economics of human behavior. And by the end of this part, you will understand why so many generous people are loved in words, but neglected in action. The psychology of scarcity, why humans value what can disappear. One of the most powerful laws of human perception is this: scarcity creates value. This principle governs markets, status, romance, power, and attention. Rare things are valued, limited things are protected, difficult things are pursued, uncertain things are taken more seriously. Why? Because the human mind instinctively assigns importance to what is not guaranteed. That is why people suddenly become more attentive when they sense they might lose access to you. That is why someone who ignored your messages begins acting differently when you become less available. That is why people who casually borrowed from your generosity become emotionally restless when you begin to pull back. Because now, your presence is no longer guaranteed. And once certainty disappears, attention rises. This is not always love. Sometimes it is simply psychological recalibration. The mind wakes up when comfort is threatened. This is why many people only realize your value after distance enters the equation. Not because your value suddenly increased, but because your availability decreased, and availability changes perception. Machiavelli understood this deeply. He knew that one of the quickest ways to lose authority is to make yourself too common, too open, too accessible, and too easy to consume. Because once people stop fearing the loss of access, they stop handling you carefully. That applies to money, to time, to emotional labor, to loyalty, to your presence itself. And this is why many generous people are slowly disrespected over time. Not because they did one terrible thing, but because they taught others that they would always be there, no matter what. No matter the neglect, no matter the imbalance, no matter the delayed appreciation, no matter the repeated overstepping. And once people internalize that, a dangerous psychological message forms. I do not need to be careful with this person. They are not going anywhere. That is when respect begins to erode, quietly, gradually, almost invisibly, until one day you wake up and realize you have become emotionally cheap in the lives of people you once poured deeply into. That pain is real, but it is not random. It follows a pattern. Why some people only treat you well after you withdraw. This is one of the most infuriating realities of human behavior. Sometimes the exact people who ignored your efforts suddenly become attentive the moment you stop trying. Suddenly they check in. Suddenly they explain themselves. Suddenly they ask if you are okay. Suddenly they become concerned. And the person who has been overgiving often feels confused. They think, why did I have to disappear for you to notice me? That question has broken many hearts, but the answer is simple and brutal. Because your constant effort removed the urgency of your value. As long as you kept showing up no matter how they behaved, they had no psychological reason to adjust. Your loyalty became a cushion for their laziness. Your consistency became a permission slip for their inconsistency. Your patience became the hiding place for their irresponsibility. And because there were no consequences, there was no urgency. This is one of the most dangerous mistakes people make in relationships. They confuse silent endurance with maturity. They think constantly tolerating disrespect makes them evolved. They think endlessly understanding bad behavior makes them noble. They think absorbing imbalance without complaint makes them different. But often all it does is delay the moment of truth. Because people do not always change through explanation. Many change through consequence. That is why absence often teaches what presence never could. That is why distance can reveal what conversations fail to fix. That is why silence can expose value more than over-explaining ever will. Machiavelli would see this clearly. He understood that people respond more seriously to what threatens their comfort than what simply requests fairness.
That is why your withdrawal can suddenly make people understand. Not because they became wiser overnight, but because they finally felt the cost. And human beings rarely respect cost until they personally experience it. Useful people are often loved functionally, not deeply. This is one of the saddest truths many givers eventually discover. Some people do not love you deeply, they love you functionally. That means they are attached to what your presence does for their life, not necessarily who you are at your core. They love how you make things easier. They love your reliability. They love your emotional labor. They love your support. They love your resources. They love your problem solving. They love the comfort of knowing you are there. But remove the function, and suddenly the connection weakens. That is painful, because when you are a naturally generous person, you often assume your effort is building intimacy. But effort does not always create depth. Sometimes it simply creates convenience. And convenience is one of the most dangerous substitutes for love, because convenience feels warm until the day you stop providing it. That is when many people discover who truly values them and who is merely benefiting from them. This is why some people feel strangely lonely even when surrounded by those they have helped, because deep down they sense something is off. They sense they are admired for their role, but not truly understand as a person. And that loneliness cuts differently, because it's not the loneliness of being unseen by strangers, it's the loneliness of being used by familiar faces. Machiavelli would tell you to study that carefully, because a person who is only loved for their function is always one crisis away from replacement. That is not paranoia, that is pattern recognition. If your place in someone's life depends entirely on what you provide, then your position is unstable. And unstable positions are dangerous. Why money changes how people see you. Now, let's move directly into one of the darkest parts of this topic. Money changes perception. Not just because money has practical value, but because money reveals hidden structures in relationships. Who expects, who feels entitled, who manipulates, who performs closeness, who becomes distant when denied, who feels ownership over your resources. Nothing exposes the truth of human dynamics faster than money. Because money is not just currency, it's stored power, stored time, stored labor, stored sacrifice, stored options, stored freedom. So whenever you give money carelessly, you are not just handing out cash, you are transferring power. And the problem is, many people do not respect transferred power if they didn't earn it. That is a difficult truth. What people earn, they tend to value. What people receive too easily, they often normalize. This is why financial generosity can become one of the fastest routes to silent disrespect if not handled with intelligence. At first, people may act grateful, but over time, if there are no standards, no limits, no structure, and no accountability, that gratitude often mutates into expectation. Then expectation mutates into entitlement. And entitlement eventually mutates into resentment the moment you say no. This is why some people become angry not when you harm them, but when you stop funding the version of them that benefited from your softness. That anger is revealing, because it shows you they were never simply receiving help. They had begun to feel ownership over their generosity. And ownership is dangerous. The moment someone feels entitled to your money, your giving has already crossed into political territory. Now it is no longer about kindness. Now it is about control, access, and emotional leverage. And if you do not understand that, people will use morality to manipulate your resources. They will call you selfish when you protect yourself. They will act shocked when you set limits. They will rewrite your history of giving as though it was never enough. Why? Because once a person builds comfort around your resources, your boundaries begin to feel like oppression to them. That is why many generous people are misunderstood the moment they become disciplined. Not because discipline is wrong, but because discipline disrupts dependency. And dependency always resists being interrupted. The person who can leave holds more power. This is one of the oldest and most uncomfortable laws of human dynamics. The person who can walk away usually holds more power. Not because leaving is always noble, not because detachment is always healthy, but because the ability to withdraw changes the psychological structure of a relationship. When people know you can leave, they handle you differently. When they know your time is not endless, they become more careful. When they know your support is not guaranteed, they become more attentive. When they know your presence has conditions, they begin to respect limits. Why? Because your existence is no longer emotionally cheap. This is why the inability to walk away makes many people vulnerable to disrespect. If someone knows you will always stay, always forgive, always fund, always explain, always return, always tolerate, always rescue, then what pressure do they feel to evolve? What urgency do they feel to improve? What fear do they feel about losing access? Very little. And this is
why explaining your value too much lowers it. There is another mistake many generous people make. They keep trying to verbally explain their value to people who have already become comfortable undervaluing them. They say things like, "After all I've done for you, I've always been there for you. You know how much I've sacrificed. I've supported you so many times." And while the pain behind those words is valid, there is a hidden problem.
The more you have to explain your value, the less it is being naturally felt. That is painful, but true. Real value does not need constant pleading to be acknowledged. If someone has repeatedly benefited from your effort and still treats you carelessly, the issue is often not misunderstanding. It is comfort. They understand more than you think. They have simply adjusted to your presence in a way that minimizes its cost. That is why endless explanation often fails. Because some people do not need more words. They need a new reality, a new pattern, a new boundary, a new distance, a new consequence. Machiavelli understood that perception changes more through structure than through emotional appeal. This is why powerful people do not spend all their energy begging to be understood. They alter the terms of access. They change what is available. They reposition themselves. And suddenly, what was once taken lightly begins to feel heavy again. That is not manipulation. That is self-respect made visible. Why some people secretly despise the person who helps them. Now, this part is dark, but necessary. Because not everyone responds to help with love. Sometimes, they respond with resentment. Yes, resentment. Why? Because help can trigger shame in people who are deeply insecure. When you help someone repeatedly, especially financially or emotionally, it can quietly remind them of what they cannot do for themselves. And instead of processing that honestly, some people convert their shame into hostility. Not always openly, sometimes subtly. They become dismissive, cold, ungrateful, critical, emotionally distant, passive-aggressive. And the giver often feels confused. They think, why are you treating me badly when I've done so much for you? Because your generosity may have become a mirror they hate looking into. It exposed their dependence, their instability, their lack of discipline, their neediness, their inability to stand on their own. And weak egos do not always well to mirrors. Sometimes, they punish the person reflecting their discomfort. This is why generosity without discernment is dangerous. Not because generosity is evil, but because dependency is psychologically humiliating to certain personalities. And instead of growing from that discomfort, they attack the source. Machiavelli would absolutely understand this. He knew that people do not only react to what benefits them, they also react to what threatens their self-image. And if your generosity accidentally makes someone feel small, exposed, or inferior, they may not love you more for it. They may quietly resent you. That is why generosity without discernment is dangerous, because not everyone is emotionally healthy enough to receive help with humility.
How people use morality to control generous people. There is a form of manipulation more dangerous than aggression, more dangerous than shouting, more dangerous than threats, more dangerous than obvious betrayal. And that form of manipulation is this: making a good-hearted person feel guilty for protecting themselves. That is one of the oldest and most effective power games in human relationships. Because once someone discovers that your identity is tied to being good, kind, understanding, selfless, or there for people, they no longer need force to control you. They can use guilt. They can use disappointment. They can use emotional withdrawal. They can use moral pressure. They can use "after all I've been through" stories. They can use tears. They can use silence. They can use obligation. They can use family language. They can use loyalty language. They can use suffering as leverage. And suddenly, what looks like a simple request is no longer simple, because beneath it is an unspoken threat. If you say no, you are not the kind person you believe yourself to be. That is psychological warfare. And many generous people do not even realize they are living inside it. They think they are just helping. But in reality, they are being emotionally trained to betray themselves in order to preserve an image. An image of being nice. An image of being loyal. An image of being soft. An image of being different. And that image becomes a prison. Machiavelli would recognize this immediately, because he understood something that still terrifies people today. The easiest people to control are often not the weak, but the morally predictable. If someone knows exactly which emotional button will make you surrender your boundaries, then your generosity is no longer your strength. It has become their access point. And tonight, we are exposing every layer of that game. The guilt trap: how good people get manipulated. Let's begin with the oldest weapon of all: guilt. Guilt is one of the most powerful emotional tools ever created because it attacks not your fear, but your identity. Fear says something bad may happen, but guilt says you are becoming a bad person. That is much deeper. Because many generous people can handle stress. They can handle hard work. They can handle sacrifice. They can handle inconvenience. But what they struggle to handle is the feeling that they are disappointing people or becoming selfish. That is the opening manipulators exploit. They learn your conscience. They study your softness. They notice what language makes you collapse inward. And then, whether consciously or unconsciously, they begin using that language to keep you available. You hear things like, "I thought you were different. Wow, I didn't expect this from you. After all we've been through? So you can't even help me with this little thing? If it were you, I would do it. You've changed. Money has entered your head. You now think you're too big. Family should not behave like this. A real friend wouldn't say no." These statements are not always innocent. Sometimes they are emotional crowbars, tools used to pry open your boundaries. And the reason they work is because many generous people have built their self-worth around being seen as good. So the moment saying no threatens that identity, they panic. And they give in. Again, and again, and again. Not because they truly wanted to, but because guilt overpowered their self-protection. That is why guilt is such a dangerous weapon, because it can make self-betrayal feel like virtue. And once that pattern begins, you can spend years sacrificing your peace to avoid being misunderstood by people who were never going to be satisfied anyway. Machiavelli would call this a failure of inner rule. Because if someone can consistently manipulate your conscience against your own survival, then your moral nature has become a political weakness. That sounds harsh, but it is true. When "help me" is actually a test of control. Not every request is just a request. Sometimes it is a test of your flexibility, a test of your guilt threshold, a test of your inability to disappoint people, a test of whether your no means anything. This is especially true when someone keeps asking for things they could solve themselves but prefer not to. They may not be asking because they are helpless. They may be asking because they know you are easier than responsibility. And that distinction matters, because there is a difference between supporting someone through a hard season and becoming their preferred escape route from adulthood. That difference changes everything. Some people do not need rescue. They need discomfort. They need accountability. They need consequences. They need to feel the weight of their own choices long enough to grow. But if your generosity keeps shielding them from that weight, you are not always helping. Sometimes you are interrupting their evolution. And because they enjoy that protection, they may become very skilled at presenting dependency as innocence. They will make every request sound urgent, every emergency sound tragic, every irresponsibility sound understandable. And if you are not careful, you will become the emotional or financial shortcut they use instead of changing. That is dangerous, because once someone learns they can outsource their discomfort to your kindness, your generosity becomes a system they depend on. And systems create power dynamics. Now your refusal is no longer just refusal. To them, it feels like disruption. And disruption often triggers anger in people who have built comfort around your compliance. That is why some people react so strongly when you finally say no. Not because your boundary is unfair, but because your boundary interrupts a pattern that benefited them. Machiavelli would say, pay attention to who becomes offended when your limits become real. That offense is often more revealing than any apology. Family pressure, the most normalized form of exploitation. Now let's talk about one of the hardest realities of all. Family can be one of the strongest channels of manipulation. This is painful to admit because family is supposed to represent safety, loyalty, and belonging. But in many lives, family is also where boundaries are least respected. Because family often comes with inherited expectations, unspoken obligations, emotional debts, cultural pressure, role assignments. And once you are identified as the responsible one, the kind one, the successful one, or the one who always comes through, you can become a target for endless extraction. Not always out of evil, sometimes out of habit, sometimes out of entitlement, sometimes of unhealed dependency. But whatever the source, the effect is the same. You become a person before you are allowed to be a human being, meaning your role matters more than your limits. Your usefulness matters more than your rest. Your contribution matters more than your peace. And if you try to protect yourself, you may be hit with one of the oldest emotional chains in existence. But we are family. Blood is thicker than water. Family is all we have. So strangers will benefit more from you than your own people? After all your family did for you? You want to forget where you came from? You can't be doing well and leave your people behind. Now, let's be honest. Some of these statements come from pain. Some come from cultural reality. But many are also used to pressure the most conscientious person in the family into carrying burdens that were never fairly distributed.
And because the person often loves deeply, they feel trapped. If they keep giving, they drown. If they stop, they feel guilty. That is the prison. And Machiavelli would say something many people are too afraid to say aloud. Love does not cancel the need for structure. Even in family. Especially in family. Because where emotional familiarity is high, exploitation can become normalized and invisible. And one sacrifice becomes your assigned family role. People may stop asking what you can afford. Financially, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. They simply expect. That expectation can quietly ruin a life. How suffering gets used as emotional leverage. Now let's go darker. Because one of the most powerful tools used against generous people is this. Suffering as leverage. When someone is hurting, struggling, broke, abandoned, unstable, or emotionally shattered, your compassion naturally opens. That is human. That is beautiful. But here's where danger enters. Some people learn that their pain gives them influence over your boundaries. They may not even fully realize they are doing it. But the pattern becomes clear. Every time you try to create distance, their suffering suddenly takes center stage. Every time you say no, their crisis becomes louder. Every time you protect your peace, their pain is used to morally corner you. And now your boundary begins to feel cruel. Not because it is cruel, but because their suffering has been psychologically placed beside it. This is where many people collapse. Because they think, how can I say no when they're going through so much? That question has emptied many bank accounts, drained many hearts, and delayed many destinies. Because compassion without discernment is dangerous. Yes, people suffer. Yes, people struggle. Yes, pain deserves empathy. But empathy does not mean you must become a permanent rescue system for everyone in crisis. That is not sustainable. And it is not wise. Machiavelli would warn you not to confuse someone's pain with your responsibility. That distinction is critical. Because some people are in pain and trying to heal. Others are in pain and using it to create permanent emotional access to your energy. Those are not the same. And if you cannot tell the difference, you will keep sacrificing yourself in the name of compassion while your life slowly loses shape. False loyalty. How people use relationship to demand access. There is another very common manipulation tactic. Using loyalty language to bypass boundaries. This happens when someone tries to make the relationship itself the reason you should keep giving, tolerating, or sacrificing. They say things like, a real friend would understand. If you truly loved me, you wouldn't make this difficult. We've known each other for years. You should be able to do this for me. What's the point of friendship if you can't help? I'm not a stranger now. At first, this sounds emotional and relational. But underneath, it often means, because of my connection, I should have easier access to your boundaries. That is dangerous. Because real loyalty does not demand self-betrayal. Real love does not require the collapse of your standards. Real friendship does not punish your self-respect. In fact, healthy relationships are strengthened by boundaries, not threatened by them. But manipulative relationships hate boundaries because boundaries reveal motive. They force the truth to surface. And truth is uncomfortable for people who are benefiting from your over-availability. Machiavelli would understand this perfectly. Because loyalty, in its corrupted form, becomes a political tool. A word used not to honor connection, but to secure compliance. And once you understand that, many conversations will start sounding different. You will begin to hear the hidden message beneath emotional language. And that awareness alone can protect your life.
Why generous people often get angry too late. One of the saddest patterns in human behavior is this. Good-hearted people often wait too long before they get angry. They excuse too much. They rationalize too much. They forgive too quickly. They keep hoping people will understand. They keep assuming the best. They keep stretching. And because they delay their own anger, people around them often mistake patience for endless capacity. That is dangerous. Because when your boundaries are weak, your resentment becomes delayed, but not absent. It builds quietly, under the surface, beneath the smiles, beneath the favors, beneath the it's okay, beneath the don't worry, beneath the I understand, until one day, it explodes. And now the generous person looks like the villain. People say, "Why are you overreacting? You should have said something. I didn't know it was that deep. You're suddenly acting strange." But the truth is, the explosion was not sudden. It was just postponed. This is why suppressed anger is dangerous. Because anger is not always evil. Sometimes anger is information. It tells you, something in your life has been violating you for too long.
And if you keep ignoring that signal in order to remain nice, you will eventually become bitter, unstable, or emotionally numb. Machiavelli would not tell you to become reckless, but he would tell you to respect early signals. Because the person who cannot express boundaries early often ends up expressing rage late. And late rage usually arrives after too much damage has already been done. How to know when you are being emotionally extorted. Now let's make this practical. How do you know when generosity has crossed into manipulation? Look for these signs. You are probably being emotionally extorted if you feel guilty every time you try to say no. You feel like your value depends on what you provide. You are constantly needed, but rarely deeply considered. People become cold, distant, or dramatic when you set limits. Your kindness is expected, not appreciated. You keep helping, but the same problems never end. You feel exhausted, but somehow still obligated. You are more afraid of disappointing others than disappointing yourself. You keep sacrificing peace to preserve relationships that do not feel safe. If that is your pattern, then what is happening may not simply be generosity. It may be conditioning. You may have been trained by family, by friendships, by culture, by heartbreak, by childhood roles, to believe that your goodness must always cost you. That is a lie. A destructive one. Because goodness that constantly destroys the giver is not sustainable virtue. It is a slow form of self-abandonment. And self-abandonment always invites predators.
How to be generous without losing power. There comes a point in life when a person must make a decision, a painful one, a necessary one, a life-altering one, and that decision is this: will I continue giving in ways that slowly destroy me, or will I learn how to give with wisdom? Because that is the difference between a good-hearted person who survives and a good-hearted person who gets consumed. The world is full of people who started soft and became bitter, who started generous and became cold, who started loving and became detached, not because they were born that way, but because they gave without structure for too long, and eventually the pain changed them. That is what this final part is here to prevent. You do not need to become heartless to become protected. You do not need to become cruel to become respected. You do not need to shut down your humanity to keep your dignity. But you do need to understand one powerful truth. Kindness without strategy is not safe. That single truth can save your life, emotionally, financially, mentally, relationally. Because in a world where people can admire your softness while quietly exploiting it, your heart must be guarded by intelligence. And that is what we are building now. The first shift: stop thinking of generosity as a personality trait. This is the first transformation. Many people think generosity is just who they are. They say, "I just have a good heart. That's just me. I can't help it. I've always been this way. I naturally give." And while that may sound beautiful, there is a hidden danger in it. Because when generosity becomes a fixed identity, you may begin to feel guilty anytime you act outside that role. You may start believing that every refusal is a betrayal of yourself. Every boundary feels unnatural. Every limit feels mean. Every no feels like a personality crisis. That is dangerous, because it means you are no longer choosing generosity, you are trapped inside it. And anything you cannot consciously regulate can be used against you. That is why your first shift must be this: stop seeing generosity as your identity. Start seeing it as a tool, a powerful tool, a beautiful tool, a sacred tool, but still a tool. And tools are meant to be used wisely, not compulsively. A surgeon does not use every instrument on every patient. A builder does not use every material in every structure. A wise person does not pour generosity into every hand that reaches. That is not hardness, that is intelligence. Machiavelli would absolutely approve of this, because one of the marks of real power is selective action. Not acting from impulse, not reacting from guilt, but choosing deliberately. That is the beginning of freedom. Learn the difference between a real need and a recycled pattern. This one principle can save you from years of exploitation. You must learn to ask, is this person truly in need, or are they repeating a pattern? That question changes everything, because not every crisis is a genuine emergency. Not every struggle is accidental. Not every problem is temporary. Not every request is innocent. Not every hard season is truly a season. Some people are in pain. Others are in cycles. And if you do not learn the difference, you will keep mistaking repeated irresponsibility for unfortunate circumstances. That mistake is expensive. A real need often comes with humility, effort, accountability, and a desire to improve. A recycled pattern often comes with excuses, repetition, dependency, and emotional pressure. A person in a real need may ask for help once and use it as a bridge. A person in a repeated pattern may keep asking because your help has become part of how they avoid change. That distinction matters deeply, because helping a person in transition is different from funding a person in stagnation. And if your generosity keeps interrupting the natural consequences that might have forced growth, then your help is no longer helping, it is preserving dysfunction. Machiavelli would say, do not reward what weakens the structure. That applies to kingdoms, and it applies to relationships.
Never let your generosity outrun your stability. This is one of the most important rules you can ever live by. Your generosity must never be bigger than your foundation. Never. If helping someone puts your peace at risk, be careful. If helping someone disrupts your own survival, be careful. If helping someone weakens your future, be careful. If helping someone consistently costs your self-respect, be careful. Because one of the biggest lies many people believe is this: if I really care, I should sacrifice whatever it takes. No, that is not wisdom. That is emotional recklessness dressed up as virtue. You cannot pour from a cup that is collapsing. You cannot build others while your own structure is cracking. You cannot keep carrying everyone else and still expect to remain whole if no one is carrying you. This is why many generous people quietly live in internal depletion. They are always helping externally while slowly eroding internally. And eventually that imbalance catches up. Machiavelli would never advise that, because from a power perspective, self-depletion is dangerous. A depleted person becomes reactive. A depleted person becomes resentful. A depleted person loses clarity. A depleted person becomes easier to control. That is why your first responsibility is not to impress the world with your sacrifice. It is to remain structurally strong enough that your kindness can exist without costing your core. That is power. Give less often, but give better. This is where many people need to mature. They think being generous means giving often, but true wisdom understands something deeper. Sometimes the strongest generosity is not frequent, it is intentional. That means instead of giving impulsively, emotionally, or repeatedly, you begin giving strategically, with thought, with boundaries, with structure, with awareness of long-term consequences. This changes the quality of your help, because random generosity often creates temporary relief, but wise generosity can create real transformation. For example, instead of repeatedly giving money to someone with no accountability, you may help once with a clear limit. Instead of always being emotionally available for someone committed to chaos, you may offer support without becoming their therapist. Instead of solving every problem for people, you may begin asking better questions and encouraging responsibility. This is where your generosity becomes powerful, because now it is no longer feeding dependency, it is supporting dignity. And dignity is different from comfort. Comfort says, I will remove all your pain for you. Dignity says, I care about you enough not to make you weaker. That is mature love, and many people are not used to it because they have been conditioned to equate care with endless rescue. But endless rescue can be destructive. Machiavelli would understand this perfectly, because when giving is too easy, too frequent, and too unconditional, it stops commanding value. But when generosity is measured, selected, and attached to standards, it gains weight, and weight creates respect. Create a private rulebook for your kindness. This may sound simple, but it is one of the most life-changing things you can do. Create rules for how you give. Not random moods, not emotional impulses. Rules. Private standards. Internal policies. A code. Why does this matter? Because if you don't decide your boundaries in advance, people will decide them for you in the moment. And moments are dangerous, especially emotional moments. Moments of pressure, moments of pity, moments of guilt, moments of urgency, moments of tears, moments of just this once. That is when many people betray themselves. So instead of improvising every time, create a personal rulebook. For example, I do not lend money I cannot emotionally afford to lose. I do not repeatedly rescue adults from consequences they created. I do not explain my no more than once. I do not overextend to maintain relationships. I do not help in ways that create silent resentment. I do not become the permanent solution to temporary problems. I only give where there is humility, effort, and respect. Do you see how powerful that is? Now your generosity is no longer at the mercy of pressure. It is protected by principle. That changes your life, because principled people are much harder to manipulate than emotional reactors. Machiavelli would absolutely respect this, because systems are stronger than moods, and a person with internal systems is much harder to destabilize. Make peace with being misunderstood. This is one of the hardest but most necessary evolutions in life. You must become comfortable being misunderstood by people who benefited from your lack of boundaries. That sentence alone can free you, because one of the biggest reasons people stay trapped in overgiving is this: they want to protect their image. They want everyone to still see them as kind, generous, easygoing, helpful, loyal, available. But once you begin changing, some people will not celebrate your growth. They will interpret your healing as betrayal, your discipline as pride, your boundaries as selfishness, your silence as attitude, your refusal as wickedness. And if you are addicted to being seen positively, this stage will break you, unless you understand one truth. Not all misunderstanding is a sign you are wrong. Sometimes misunderstanding is simply the emotional protest of people losing convenient access to you. That is all. And if you cannot tolerate that discomfort, you will keep returning to old patterns just to preserve a false image. Machiavelli would tell you clearly, it is better to be respected with resistance than loved through self-erasure. That is a hard truth, but it is a liberating one. The invisible generosity is often the most powerful. Now, let's go deeper. One of the mistakes many people make is tying generosity to performance. They want to be seen helping, seen sacrificing, seen supporting, seen being good. But visible generosity can sometimes become a trap, because the more